So our second presentation today is entitled BC's Independent Environmental Monitor System, a potential option for restoring trust in large development projects in the Yukon. It's a joint presentation between Kathy McKay and Pat Tobler from EDI. Kathy McKay is the Chief Operating Officer of EDI Environmental Dynamics. She's a professional biologist and agroecologist, holds a Master of Science degree from UNBC. EDI is an environmental consulting business that began in Prince George in 1994, has grown to over 150 staff in BC, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Yukon. Kathy leads a team committed to the practical application of aquatic and terrestrial science to help their clients while maintaining the integrity of the environment that we all share. Kathy's originally from Taylor, BC, and calls Prince George home. Pat Tobler is a senior fisheries biologist, regional director of EDI's Whitehorse office for over 24 years. He's also a professional biologist and a certified professional in erosion and sediment control. Throughout his time in the Yukon, Pat's been involved in various aspects of development projects, from numerous on-the-ground fisheries assessments to YESIB assessments, to serving as an expert witness at the water board hearings, and is very familiar with Yukon's regulatory environment. Pat and his team complete work for First Nations, governments, and has seen the challenges that all parties face with Yukon regulatory system. So please welcome Kathy and Pat. I'll just have a seat here.
Okay. I'm going to be just giving a bit of Yukon context, and then I'm going to pass it over to Kathy to explain the independent environmental monitoring system in BC as a potential option here in the Yukon. I don't know if it is the right option, but we wanted to get it out there just for discussion. So some of you may remember that about 5 years ago, I gave a talk here at the Geoscience Forum about regulatory differences between jurisdictions. And the main sort of points from that discussion was that Yukon has a really front-loaded system. A lot of effort and scrutiny is focused in on the front parts of projects. So essentially the assessment part, the permitting. But then once permits are issued, projects are constructed with sort of minimal oversight. And that can lead to some less than stellar on-the-ground performance, which can sort of undermine the trust in development in Yukon. And 5 years later, I don't think we've made any advancements here. Therefore, today, we're presenting again with a potential option. So Yukon's current predicament. So we obviously have a complex assessment and permitting process here in the Yukon that receives a lot of attention from various parties. We are seeing a changing world with higher and higher expectations on development projects. In the Yukon, we've had a number of projects that have seen issues during the construction and operation components of those projects. That includes very small projects, medium-sized infrastructure projects, right up to a really large development. We have 7 Type 2 abandoned mines in the Yukon, and that doesn't include a Wolverine or the Eagle Gold Mine. So those, those are in the memory of Yukoners. And all of these things have led to low public trust, low trust from First Nations and regulators in the Yukon. So Yukon's assessment and permitting system is quite complex. Obviously, if you're going to plan a development project, the first thing you need to do is go through a YESA assessment. So for a large project, that can take many years. Once you get through the assessment process, then you get your permits. I've listed a few here, but you might need even more. And a lot of these permitting processes can also take years and a lot of effort before you're ready to put shovels in the ground for your development project. During this assessment and permitting process, there's a lot of scrutiny from First Nations, from various government departments, Fisheries and Oceans and other federal departments, NGOs, and of course in Yukon, we have a very vocal public and they participate quite strongly in the assessment and the permitting process. So once a developer gets their permits, construction can take place really quickly. These companies have spent a lot of time on assessment and permitting. Once they get their permits, they want to get this thing built really efficiently and effectively. Many things can happen during that process. And often for these larger projects, the construction team, as well as the environmental team, might be new to the project once that construction phase starts. So many of these people aren't familiar with all the project commitments that were made during the assessment process or the multiple permitting conditions that are associated with the project. They're focused on getting this thing built as soon as possible. In terms of inspectors, Yukon government inspectors are usually assigned to projects. These inspectors were not involved with the assessment or the permitting components. So they too are unfamiliar with all the project commitments and the permit conditions. And they're in a very sort of unfair position where they're the eyes and ears of the project or overseeing the project and reporting back to others on it. And they have multiple projects that they're looking at too. So if there's a big complex project, it's really unfair for them to be the only eyes and ears on the ground. There are a number of mandatory monitoring reports that need to be submitted to the various agencies, including the Water Board. What I've found, in my opinion, is that those are completed. Companies are aware of the requirements. They need to complete these reports, but they get submitted to the various agencies and often are not reviewed to the level of scrutiny that they should be. It's more of a checkbox thing. Have you submitted these reports to the Water Board, for example? And there's no involvement from YESA or the Water Board in the construction and monitoring unless there are significant changes to the project. In my previous presentation, I talked a lot about other jurisdictions where they have a cradle to grave process. So assessment agencies will be involved in the project right from when it's first submitted to when the mine or project is put to bed. In Yukon, YESA is only focused on the assessment part, and then they're done. And while that might be favorable for the proponents, the assessors are not actually seeing what's being built on the ground, and they're not learning. So there's no sort of feedback in this system. So I guess what I'm saying is that in the Yukon, the balance of scrutiny on projects is focused on those early stages, the assessment and the permitting components. But once the project is built, there's limited oversight to ensure that the project is implemented as planned. So if you think of each of these as a separate system, assessment, permitting, and then construction and operations, to really sort of fix any problems, you got to know where these problems are occurring. And in my opinion, we are seeing a lot of cracks on the construction, operation, the implementation side of projects. But what we're doing in the Yukon is we are trying to fix those problems by putting more emphasis on assessment and permitting. Of course, those components may be important, but we're currently not doing anything to address those fractures on the construction and operation side of things. So it's fair maybe to add, or it might be fair to try to do some things on the assessment and permitting side, but if we're not addressing the construction and operation side of things, we're not going to see the outcomes that we want to see. We really need to address those issues to gain that trust for good projects in the Yukon. So, in summary, we really need or what's really important is that we are building good projects on the ground. And I think we really need to come up with systems that might help us achieve that so that we can build trust back up here in the Yukon. As such, I've invited Kathy to come up and tell us about the Independent Environmental Monitoring Program in BC. This may be a potential solution, I don't know, but I wanted to get it out there because we need to do something to make sure that we have our building projects well on the ground.
Okay. All right. Just to take a step back, so EDI started in Prince George in 1994. Pat came to the company in Prince George in 96. Soon after, expanded into Whitehorse in 2000 and went south from there. A little bit unique in that sense. One of the roles that we've done from early on is environmental monitoring during construction. One of the key messages here that I hope to make is the independent environmental monitor role is unique. It's not, I think one of the things I've been talking to people about, what they think about the IEM role, and people envision the environmental monitoring during construction. And it's quite different. It's unique and it's really important. How it's done is very important to if it is a successful model. So a little background here. So the BC Environmental Assessment Act is the comparable to the ESSA. And like in the Yukon, as Pat has summarized, you get a BC Environmental Assessment Certificate, then there's a lot of major permits and small permits, and that process takes quite some time. In 2002, that was when the BC Environmental Assessment Act first came in. And some historical context, in 2010, the then Premier Gordon Campbell announced plans to build Site C. And there were a few other high-profile projects at the time. A little bit about Site C, it's near where I grew up in Taylor, BC, which maybe some of you have driven through there, and if you blinked, you missed it. About mile 30 of the Alaska Highway, it crosses the Peace River, or the bridge that crosses the Peace there. And in the 70s and 80s, Site C was a hot topic, and a lot of advocacy on both sides for the project against it. It wasn't built then, but in 2010, the government at the time announced there was plans to build it. And other high-profile projects, the Prosperity Mine, Northern Gateway. So what came from this, or something that came from this, is the BC Auditor General did a review of the EA process to determine whether the EAO was ensuring that the potential significant adverse effects of a project were being avoided and mitigated. So, in other words, the government being responsible for seeing through the permitting, assessment and permitting of the projects, but also the responsibility carried through to how the project was built and whether the conditions that were a requirement of the project were actually met on the ground. So the result of this review, and you see it's the Auditor General review, so there was a liability there for BC that triggered that review. And in 2011, the outcome was no. The answer was no. There was deficiencies in that post-certificate monitoring and oversight, and there was public need for more accountability. And there were 6 recommendations from this report, but the one I'll focus on here is that the IEM role was one of the things that came out of this as part of the recommendation to enhance the compliance and enforcement program that the BC Environmental Assessment Office was accountable for. And so the Site C project, it's one that we've been the IEM on since 2014, so we're still on it, the reservoir's filled, and so I'll come back to that to provide some examples. So 2014, that was a requirement, and then all new certificates from 2017, IEM was part of the requirement. So we carried on to be the IEM on Bruce Jack and Kamess Underground and currently Blackwater. So what is the role? This is a summary in a nutshell. Is the project being built in the manner it was authorized? And so specifically, the IEM role is funded by the proponent. The proponent hires and engages the IEM. And this is an example of how it's written into a certificate, Schedule B, that the holder of the certificate must retain those services. And you can find this and similar documents on the BC EPIC site, as it's called, Environmental Project Information Center, or something like that. The acronym stands for EPIC. So this applies for this particular project through construction, operations, closure, post-closure. I've got to speak to this picture. So person on the right there is Graham Patterson. He's the IEM on the Site C project and Blackwater. And here we are on a little bike tour in overlooking the Nechako River in Prince George with our sparkly swag on. And I wanted to take a moment to say, like, the person, and my role in this, in IEM services, I've recruiting, retaining, and getting the right people on the job. And that's a really key component, because it's not just construction monitoring. That person needs to be part of the proponent team, be building trust on the team and with the regulator in order to be the middle ground and the independent monitor that they are. But there's a real nuance to doing that effectively, because it really does have to have a trust position. And I'll just say it takes some time to get there. And going back to the example of Site C, first few years, it took some time to get there, until the point when BC Hydro was asking us for our opinion and seeing the value to it. And then I would say 100% confident that they would have very positive things to say about us and our role in IEM to this day. So the first step is terms of engagement are written and accepted by the Environmental Assessment Office and First Nations. We then dive into maybe however many management plans, 30 management plans or possibly more that are written on the project, and extract all the conditions, all the will-dos, all the permit requirements from those. And then we compile that together, delete overlap, redundancies, and come up with a database of a few hundred committed requirements that we focus on. So Data documentation, there's a large amount of data there. And just as an example, and keep in mind the Site C example, there's over 6,000 records collected to date. And so that is over a 10-year period. And so those records, this is an example screenshot, example data, I can't show any confidential data, of course, of where you've got a location and then the data record associated with it. Photo documentation, follow-up, flagged to who owns it and whether follow-up is required. And then the reports would go to the EAO and First Nations and other agencies that we report to, which in some cases, in the case of Site C, Water Comptroller and the Impact Assessment Agency of Canada, since the project was also federally triggered. So what does it look like? And IEM can truly be one person, and you have that consistent person who knows a lot about all of the requirements and permits on your project, and then typically a delegate. And their expertise, their resumes would need to be reviewed and approved by the BC Environmental Assessment Office. And then you have subject matter expertise. So to fill in information, review specific documents. And for example, we have part of our Yukon office here, Lindsay Dutzel, acts as subject matter expertise on water quality. So it's not a huge, volume-wise, it's not a huge job. And when we take on this role, we're in conflict with doing anything else on the project. A little bit more specific kind of example here from Site C. This certificate was issued 2014. There were 77 detailed conditions in the certificate. So that would be in the Schedule B of the certificate. And we boiled that down to a fine reduction of 197 commitments. So what's the frequency on the site? It can be, for example, 16 to 20 times a year, depending on what's going on the project. So you can ramp up and down depending on what's going on. Blackwater construction, we're going there every second week or so. And then, of course, there is work back at the desk, reviewing documents and reporting and keeping on top of that database. And whereas, for example, the EAO might visit four times a year, which is the case on Site C. And so, yeah, moving on to the benefits. And I truly believe there's benefits here on all sides. On the government side, I think there's common ground here between how Pat outlined what's happening in the Yukon and the BC. We share the same challenges in that there's caution towards development, there's risks, and there's liabilities. And we've been able to build some projects in BC. Don't know if it's directly because of this. There's probably a lot of factors, but where there was actually quite a void there where we weren't able to develop too many projects. But Mount Milligan mine was built, and some other mines have followed and got through the permitting process. There's improved project oversight and enhanced compliance and enforcement capabilities because you have basically an IEM, it's the eyes and ears, collecting a lot of data, a consistent understanding of the whole permit requirements in detail, and then the EAO can come in as more of a triage periodically with less frequency. Benefits from First Nations perspective is there's that increased involvement and oversight, greater confidence in accountability and stewardship. And there is an environmental management committee that involves the group of First Nations directly affected by the project, and those reports go out to those nations and the environmental management committee. Benefits for the public, the improved transparency and assurance of that that environmental protection is taking place and the accountability is there. And for proponents. And I truly believe there's a benefit here for proponents. We've heard that feedback from clients, but it depends, the job has to be done well in terms of the IEM being part of the team, building that trust. And there's two sides to it. Sometimes the IEM, with their detailed knowledge of the requirements and their breadth of experience, they could come up with things that maybe are of benefit to the proponent, ways to meet conditions that might not have been thought of, and can even bring that reasoning and rationale to the regulator. So there's middle ground there, and I think that there truly is a benefit for proponents. I want to say, just from the going up a level of elevation here, I presented in April at the Impact Assessment Conference in Dublin on follow-up programs. So there's a bit of overlap here in terms of the topic, but I was on a panel with someone from University of Malta, someone from South Africa and South America. And it really resonated with me. Canada's regulatory system is very good. And that's why investors choose Canada, because the regulatory system is strong and our political stability. It's true. So I say we can strengthen this further, never should be complacent. Let's build on a strength, and there's benefit for Yukoners, for BC, for Canada, and we can contribute something meaningful to the world in terms of the important minerals that we have here in the Yukon. Summary is there's a lot of commonality here, and what happens on a mine site in Yukon and BC, things have happened and it impacts the reputation for the whole industry and the ability to move forward and develop those important projects. So the key is to gain some trust in development and build trust. And we believe that there needs to be a shift so that there's a balance of oversight across the whole piece from cradle to grave. IEM, this may be one concept, one tool in the toolbox that might enable this to take place. And with that, you can put your phone up and connect with us immediately so that you don't forget who we are. And happy to take any questions. Hello. We each have a mic now.
I got a question for you, Kathy. So why can't this role be filled by the government?
Well, one reason I think that the decision, the way that it was done, the rationale for why it was done as it was in BC, was that if the government took that whole role, they would not necessarily be reducing their liability. So I think it stratifies the liability a little bit because they've got all the details coming from the IEM that they can rely upon, but then it allows the government to, the EAO did increase their compliance and enforcement program internally, but it allows them to look at, have a group of people looking at a group of site 4 times a year and rely upon the detailed information from the IEM, which is hired by the proponent, and their information needs to be relied upon. So I believe it stratifies the risk and liability.
Martin?
Yeah, just a quick question. You may have touched on it. How does the funding structure work? So the proponent is responsible for funding the IEM?
That's right. The proponent engages as long as the EAO accepts that terms of engagement, terms of reference, and the resumes then they're good to go and the proponent hires them.
I- It is, but they're not reporting to the developer, they're reporting to others essentially, right? Devin?
I was just had a question for you, Pat. Like, do you see like a potential option just being like written in as like a mitigation in the decision document that like project requires an environmental monitor? Like, I know some of the larger projects, like generally that is part of the project that environmental monitors go out and like do this work that you're talking about.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Yukon has been struggling with this, and they have had those kinds of conditions where they say hire an environmental monitor, but the chain of command or their role is vague often. This system here and setting up a terms of reference, I think, is critical to know what their role is, to make sure that they have enough, power and say and latitude to make change over the project. Because a lot of times, as an environmental monitor on site, often we feel sort of handcuffed to the situation. And in this case, it's bigger. It's making sure that things are, done following the terms of engagement, essentially, right, for the project.
Question? Yeah.
Is there any discussion around social monitoring? Because I'm just saying this is an issue, we kind of solve an issue of trust. Is there any social monitoring going on?
Do you mean in terms of the human environment or that aspect of the assessment? That's a good question. I could get back to you. You should connect with me and I can get back to you.
I think the big thing is, like, if you can kind of take care of the environmental and have better projects, the social will probably come with it in a way, but it's a good question.
Yeah, the question is that I'll get back to you is are those requirements also folded into this or are they part of a separate scope? Question here.
First of all, just a statement. I think, Pat, you absolutely nailed the problem statement that we have here. I worked for ESF since inception for about 17 years, and I watched those cogs come into place on the assessment regulatory side and the faults on the operation and construction side. So if there is ever an advisory committee in the Yukon, I hope you're on it. My question is, when the IEM ends up in a dispute with your constructor, how are those disputes then resolved?
I wanted to ask Lindsay to answer this, but
See, looking for me. Really, disputes are resolved with a lot of communication. We spend a lot of time on calls with all the stakeholders, and we just talk through the problems. Everyone steps away and comes up with solutions, and we all decide the best path forward. That Kathy talked about how the first couple of years can be challenging until you really build that trust. And then once you get to that point, it's actually surprisingly smooth at how rare we come up with problems we can't solve. I mean, ultimately, it's up to the regulators, what's acceptable and what's not. The IEM's role is really to help the proponent find a way to that acceptability.
You want to cut us off?
Yes.
One more question.
Yeah.
Very good.
Does this apply for placer miners as well?
No, the system, the question was, would this apply for placer miners? Like, in BC, this system is for big projects like mine sites and Site C. There isn't a similar system that I know for smaller projects like placer mines yet.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Say thanks, Kathy and Pat. I have a bunch of questions, so I'm going to be finding you after myself. So thank you for that presentation.